We start out just looking at the difference between a tax credit versus a tax deduction and which benefit is better. And so ultimately the tax benefit depends on the tax rate of the taxpayer. The benefit received from a tax deduction depends on the tax rate of the taxpayer, whereas the credit is not affected by the taxpayer's rate, which typically means that a tax credit is going to be a better benefit than a tax deduction. And so we see in this problem where we have an example where there's a $1,000 expenditure and there could be a tax benefit of a 25% credit compared to the $1,000 tax deduction at various marginal rates. And so under all three scenarios, if there's a tax benefit of 25% of $1,000, each taxpayer here is getting a $250 credit. But you can see if it was a tax deduction, the impact varies depending on the tax rate that they're in. And they don't tell us what their tax rate is, but we can quickly figure it out because 120 is obviously 12% of 1,000. So Abby must be in the 12% tax rate or tax bracket, whereas Bill must be in the 35% tax bracket, and Carmen must be in a 0% tax bracket, and so there's no benefit to her at all of a tax deduction, whereas with the credit, she still receives a $250 credit. In this case of Bill, because he's in a higher tax bracket, it would actually benefit him more to get a tax deduction rather than the tax credit. But that is the case when we're comparing multiple people on different tax brackets. But if we're just comparing one person who's in a single tax bracket, so I gave us this example, we're just looking at one taxpayer with a 22% tax bracket, they have taxable income of $60,000. If they have a $1,000 tax credit, it will literally reduce their tax by $1,000. But if it's a deduction, it's only going to reduce their tax obligation by $220 or 22% of 1,000. So if we're just comparing apples to apples, like everything else is the same, then a tax credit would have a better benefit to the taxpayer. But of course, there's other considerations, such as if we're looking at multiple taxpayers in different tax brackets, such as the previous problem, then that's not always going to be the case where the credit is better. And there could be another impact where the deduction ends up putting them in a lower bracket, and so that would just mean that there would be more to consider. And it wouldn't be apples to apples like we're talking about in this example. But, like I said, all other things the same, a tax credit has a better benefit to the taxpayer than a tax deduction. So as far as credits go, there's refundable and non-refundable credits. Refundable credits mean that they'll be paid even if the amount of the credit or credits exceeds the taxpayer's tax liability. So even if the credit reduces the liability all the way to zero and there's still another $250 beyond that, then that $250 will actually be refunded to the taxpayer. A non-refundable credit is only used to offset the tax liability. So it'll pull their tax liability all the way to zero, and then if there was still $250 beyond that, it would just be lost, and the taxpayer would not get to receive that money. So they still get the benefit of their tax liability going down to zero, but they don't get a payout on top of bringing their liability down to zero. And so we're saying that the credit is lost, and then of course there are always exceptions. So some of the non-refundable credits, such as the general business credit, has a carryover provision for the excess amount. So it's not necessarily lost, it just doesn't get to go, it doesn't get to be refunded, but it can carry over to future years. And so when we're looking at some of the different refundable and non-refundable credits, on the left we have refundable. So taxes withheld on wages. If too much tax is withheld, that is a refundable credit. The Child Tax Credit, Earned Income Credit, and Affordable Care Act Premium Tax Credit are all examples of refundable credits. And then non-refundable credits would be the General Business Credit, which includes tax credit for rehabilitation expenditures, work opportunity tax credit, research activities, low-income housing, disabled access, credit for small employer pension plan startup, and employer-provided childcare. And we will look through those, and actually I think on the next slide we even have more credits to look at. Yes, we do. Continuing on with the non-refundable, still under the category of the general business credit is the credit for employer-provided family and medical leave. And now jumping out of those and just looking at non-refundable credits that are not part of the general business credit, there's credit for elderly and disabled, foreign tax, adoption expenses, dependent tax credit, credit for child and dependent care, education tax credits, energy credits, credit for certain retirement plan contributions, small employer health insurance credit, and then there's these asterisks saying, as far as the child tax credit, in 2021, it was fully refundable. That was a result of COVID. In 2022, it is refundable to the extent of 15% of the taxpayer's earned income in excess of $2,500. And parents with 3 or more qualifying children compute the refundable portion using an alternative method. The child and dependent care credit is refundable in 2021. Again, that's a result of COVID, but isn't typically a refundable credit. And as far as education tax credit goes, we look at the 2 different ones later on in this chapter, but it's 40% of the American Opportunity Credit is refundable. The other 60% is not.